Hi, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. Let's build Mike's mobile library. Let's continue building and improving Mike's mobile library. In today's session, I'm going to expand on where we left off with the more or less completed app. Gosh, it's been about a month since we worked on that. In the meantime, I have had the opportunity to explore a little bit more. I put the development version that we had created into production and started using it. And in that process, I discovered a couple of things that I wanted to include, including the ability to scan. One of the things that using a mobile device like a phone allows us to do is scan barcodes. We've already seen how you can take pictures with your phone or tablet and store that picture as the cover image for a book. But in a conversation with Shane Young at a recent presentation, the idea came up of scanning ISBN codes from the back of the books and using that information to retrieve information from an API, a web source, that would allow us to recover things like the name of the publication, authors, publisher, and so on, basic information, not the complete information that I've been storing, but enough to begin the process of storing that book and speed up the data entry, take some of the tedium out of it. So I went ahead and did that. This involves two parts. First, we needed an API that would go to a source, and we picked Google Books as the source for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. We picked the Google Books API, and then I went and created a custom connector for PowerApps that would automatically take the input from a scanned ISBN or a title entered into a field, retrieve the relevant information from that Google Books API, and I'll show you how I did that today. First, I wanted to actually show it to you in operation so you'll have some context. So you can see I've got the development environment up here. I have launched the application, and you can see my new button here, which is Scan ISBN. When I click this button, it takes me to this page, this screen. As you can see, I've already retrieved one volume to have an example. I use the enter rather than the scan because when I'm working in the browser interface, the barcode scanner is not available. It's only available on the phone. And since I can't really hook my phone up to show you how that works, we're going to do the next best thing, which is enter it manually. On the phone, we have the option to scan it, and with the scan option, when I click the scan button, it takes a picture of the barcode on the back of the book and retrieves the same information. So enter the ISBN code, in this case 0672099998, and hit enter, and after a brief pause, it brings it back. You can see that the information that it retrieves includes this. Now, there are other fields in the JSON which comes back, which I don't display here because they're not relevant to what I need. I'm only showing those parts that I do need. So it brings back an image of the cover, the title. If it has a subtitle, that will appear. The year it was first published, page count, authors, and as you can see by the frame here, it will bring back an array of authors if that is relevant to the book we're looking at. Brings back the type. Now, the Google Books API has a little different set of types, but I can translate what they do bring back, which is book, to my version, which is book. It brings back a category, which is the equivalent of my genre. Notice that it brings back computers as the category, whereas I would use software development as the category. This part is always going to be manual because I cannot create a translation, or at least I haven't yet figured out how to create a translation between their category and my genres. Then it also brings back the publisher, and in this case we found a match for the publisher, so we displayed it by default. Okay, what happened there? Oh, sorry about that. So now we can add the book to our library catalog. We have the option to include new publishers if they happen to show up as part of a scan. In addition to the basic information that I was using or wanted to use, this way I get the ISBN code, which I can add to my book library, and comments. They have a different name for it, but I translated that to comments to put it into my version. And this allows me to avoid a great deal of typing in some cases. I can add and continue to retrieve other books, or add and return. And we will go back to the publication list. We'll search that out. I'll stop the video and wait for that to respond. We're back. You'll see that I've actually entered this one twice. The first one down here, the first one at the top rather, was one that I entered in practicing for this presentation to make sure it was actually going to work. Nothing worse than being in a demo and having things fail. So I've also gone ahead and captured the image using my built-in camera function. This is not the image that comes back from the API. This is my own. And this is the one that we just added. You can see it's a duplicate essentially, except that it doesn't include the printing or the addition or the condition, which I've added here. So if I edit this version, which is the one I just now entered, you can see excellent condition. By default, it goes to excellent. SAMS, I can add the printing, the addition, the book type, and so on. And here's where the comments show up. You may or may not also notice that I have spread this out over 2 screens from what you saw in previous videos. This is another aspect of what I discovered working with this on the phone. The form factor for the browser on the large screen monitor is fine. But when I translated it to the phone, this was all too cramped close. So I spread it out, and I will continue to develop in this expanded mode for the phone. I can link the author, which is the function we had before. This will take us to this one. And it defaults to Allison Balter and mastering, and I will link them up. Go on back. And I can select an image from my image library. As the image, and we're done. Or if I want to take a new one, then I go to take cover image. So that's basically how this new function works in action. I have replicated this same function in the access interface on the desktop side. I won't introduce that to you here. I might actually do a separate video on using the same API from the desktop, but that's enough different and enough involved that I won't include it in the same video. Let's start by looking at the connector that we had to create to make it work. So we go to our data sources, and you can see here I have 2 connectors. This is the one that we're using, the Google Books. I also did a lot of testing with this one from another source called Open Library Books, which also publishes an API, which I could use to create which I did use to create a custom connector to get data from them. After comparing the two over about a dozen books, I decided that what I was getting from Google Books was actually a little bit harder to work with. And I'll explain that a little further in the video. A little bit harder to work with, but it was more complete than what I was getting from Open Library. So I bit the bullet and figured out how to make the Google Books connector work. The connector itself offers certain actions, which we'll look at as we explore bringing it back with the code. Before we do that, let's look at creating a new custom connector and how that process went. To create our custom connectors, we go to the PowerApps environment, select Dataverse. Now here we have the apps, which is where I would go in to get to the editing portion of the PowerApps. Under the Dataverse section, we have tables, choices, data flows, and so on, existing connections, and custom connectors. Down the road, we're going to come back and look at using Dataverse directly, Dataverse tables, in place of SharePoint lists. And I'll just foreshadow that that's something that's coming up down the road, hopefully within the next couple of months. For now, we're interested only in the custom connectors, which live under this section of our PowerApps. You can see that I have two that I have created. This is the Open Library Books one that I mentioned. This is the one that I'm actually using, the Google Books. So rather than create a new one first, I'll show you how this one works, and then we'll duplicate it or clone it. Step one, we upload an icon, and I just picked my standard GPC data icon. Picked a color, description. I am not using an on-premises gateway. We're connecting through HTTPS. The host, this is where we go to get all of Google's APIs. That's their global API URL. And the base URL within that is /books/. So when we go, we're going to go to www.googleapis.com/books/, and then we'll append a query string to that so that we get back the specific book that we're interested in. We don't need to authenticate, although you can obtain security and authenticate to their API. This works without it, and for now we're not going to do that. The next step is to create the definition. We give it a name, full get books. We call it test connector. That's a description, and we can modify this if we want and call it something else. The operation ID, and this is what will show up to identify the operation inside PowerApps. We will see full get books exactly as you see it here when we're ready to pull information back from the Google Books API. This is the syntax you will see there. Now, we create a request. Now, if you have experience using query string requests with URLs, you'll know exactly what this is about. If you haven't, I suggest you kind of pause or take a break, go look up, learn more about using the query string in the URL to retrieve or to send specific request information in a post to in a get to a URL. This is the request URL we're going to use. You see that it's books, but the specific section within that books is /v1/volumes. If you go to the Google Books website, you'll find this explained in their documentation. And I'm going to refer you to, and I'll put a link in the description rather than step outside and come back. I'll just refer you to that link to learn more about it. But once you get into the the documentation, the description on the Google Books section, you'll see this syntax in the URL. It has to be exactly like this, lowercase v1 and volumes. Now, we can, while we're on the Google API page, so let's look at this a little more closely. So we can refer to this when we get back into our PowerApps environment and set it up. As I explained previously, we have the base URL with books. We're looking at V1, which is version 1, the volumes section. We use the standard question mark, which you use to pass a query string. Query string is formed as Q equals the search plus terms. This request has a single required parameter. You can pass in a title, an author, a publisher, a subject, the ISBN number, which is what we're using in our scan, the LCCN, which is the Library of Congress control number, and the OCLC, which is an online computer library center number. All of these are available. I have pretty much used only in title and ISBN. The reason for that being, if I ask for an author, I get all of the works by a particular author, or many of them, or some of them. And that sort of clutters up the results that I get back in a way that I don't really want. Same is true for publisher. You're going to get all of the volumes essentially from that publisher. Subjects, very, very broad, and so on. These are, I think, alternatives that you may need in specific instances where the ISBN isn't going to give you the results. So far, I've been successful looking only at the title and the ISBN. I will note that in title means that the keyword is found within the title. It's not an exact match, it's a contains match. And here's an example of such a request for the book called Flowers for Algernon. Pass in Q, flowers, and that asks for a subject search, plus in author with the colon separating the search term from the keyword, which is keys. And then in this case, they're passing a Google API key, which means that you have authenticated. That's not required, so we don't do that. So this is how it's going to be passed in. And this is what the resulting JSON that comes back from that request looks like. I will hit the highlights. I won't go into it in detail, but this is JSON. This particular response is not well formed, as I understand the requirements of JSON. I'm by no means an expert, but there are things about it that don't quite work the way I think they're supposed to work in JSON. These are standard. The kind, which is where we got it from, and the total items, 424 items were retrieved by using that flowers as the general search term and the author keys. It returns first the book specifically that we're looking for, but there are going to be multiple other volumes returned. There's a second version of Flowers for Algernon and so on. There are a total of 424 items returned with that very broad flowers as the search term. If we put a specific title in there, of course, it is much narrower. Items, and then it lists everything that came back. So this is pretty much the header information that's going to come back as part of every JSON. It's going to tell you the kind of request we made. This is their internal ID and E tag. This is the link that you can go to directly within the Google Books to find this volume. Then we start the information about the volume. Now, I'm not going to go into all of this stuff because I don't think it's important for you to understand and use it. What we're interested in is the part that comes here, and that's what we're after. We get the title, the author. Here's where I say it's not particularly well formed, because this is actually an array. The square brackets indicate that we have an array of values, but there are no keyword pairs within the array. Title, colon, so there's keyword and identifier here as a pair. Authors should have a second level within the array that said author name or something that indicates the pair, author name, colon, Daniel Keys, or whatever that would be. As you can see, we come out of that into publisher, colon, and the name of the publisher, and so on. Because of the fact that these seem not to be particularly well formed in terms of what JSON is supposed to be looking like, I found that that was a problem when I went to retrieve it on the access side. It turned out not to be a problem within the PowerApps parsing, but on the access side it was a big problem. But I'll deal with that in a later video. We get industry identifiers, the description, publish date, and so on. As I said before, there's a lot of information that I don't need or want. Average rating, apparently that's from some rating service, how many people have rated it, and so on. Most of these are of no real use to us in our little library system, but they're available. I could attempt to parse the image links and retrieve the thumbnails that they have, but that basically duplicates what I'm doing with my cover image routine within the PowerApps, so I didn't really bother to do that, and so on. You can see there's a lot of other information that I don't particularly need or want, although it's very detailed, and that's what I was saying. This is much more detailed, much more oriented to what I wanted, but because it's not as well formed as the other one, I had to do a lot more work in the access side to actually get that information out in a usable fashion. So let's take this then and go back into our PowerApps, and we'll create a second or duplicate clone of our Google Books API. However, we've already gone quite a bit longer than I would like for a video like this, so rather than step into that section now, I think we'll call it a day as far as this version is, wrap it up, come back fresh in step 2 or phase 2, part 2 of this video, in which we will actually create a new custom connector similar to the one that we just looked at. And in that one, we'll be able to look at some of the details a little more closely. So as always, if you have enjoyed or learned something from what you've seen, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Come back in a few days as I have the second part of this particular section on using custom connectors to retrieve information from an API. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.